ready to begin with our first report presentation titled A Balanced Path to a Net Zero Future, Expansion, Flexibility, Integration and Innovation. The report is co-authored by Professor Nils-Henrik von der Fehr, CERRE Research Fellow and Professor at the University of Oslo, and by Andrei Covatariu, CERRE Research Fellow as well and member of the Energy Policy Group. For this session, Professor von der Fehr will present the report. Andrei Covatariu will join us later for the panel discussion, which will be moderated by Professor Michael Pollitt, our academic co-director at CERRE and professor at the University of Cambridge. Now, I'd like to hand over the floor to Professor Nils-Henrik von der Fehr for the presentation.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to do this report, so I'll start with a few thanks. First to my co-author, Andrei, and to the CERRE team, who has supported us through sometimes somewhat difficult periods, but not least our sponsors, GRDF, EI, and Enoda, who have, I think this is this one CERRE project I've done where we've really interacted a lot with the sponsors and had some very interesting and challenging discussions, which I think improved the end product quite a lot. From the first part of the title, the net zero is not really important in our work here. We take that as given. Path is maybe not so important either. We're sort of assuming we'll get there. The core word in this title is balanced. Could you go back one, please? Am I doing this? Yeah. Is balanced. That what we want is to get there in an orderly, cost-effective, efficient manner. There are lots of decisions to be made along the way, and we want them to be coordinated to make sure that we're moving at the same speed at different levels, and so on and so forth. And in the subtitle, I'm sorry, we sort of highlighted what some of the words that we think are key to think about when you think about a balanced path. There's going to be expansion, huge expansion, in very many areas. Generation capacity, network, infrastructure more generally, new technologies, consumer flexibility, and so on and so forth. Second, we need flexibility. This is living its own life. Maybe that's new technology. Flexibility, we need flexibility at the generation level, at the consumption level, but we also need flexibility at the regulatory side. The various decisions that are going to be made needs to be flexible. And we need integration. We need integration of markets, geographically, across Europe, but also between different energy sources. And finally, we clearly need innovation. It's very difficult to see how we can get, in an orderly fashion, to net zero without, if not breakthroughs, at least a lot of innovation in technology in the way we do things. I'm not touching this. I'm standing still. Okay, this is our report. So we first have a discussion of what we mean by imbalances. Then we have had a very interesting interaction with some of the CERRE members, as well as the sponsors and others, to discuss and to interview and to send out questionnaires to have them tell us what do they think, how do they see the challenges, and where are the imbalances and what can we do about them. We've also undertaken a number of case studies of different countries. We've selected these countries and the topics in such a way that we aim to illustrate the points that we're trying to make. On the basis of that, we have a discussion which centers on coordination. Imbalances are really a result of a lack of coordination, so that's sort of central to our study. And we point out that markets are very important. They're sort of coordination devices, but they can't solve all problems, so regulation is important as well. And based on this discussion, we end with our recommendations. Our key findings. Firstly, imbalances are a real risk. That comes out very clearly from our interaction with the practitioners, that they see these imbalances developing, and they see that they will become more serious unless things are done. We also find it in our case studies. We have a number of case studies who point to the difficulties of trying to speed up the transition. Spain is one example where they're running into difficulties of simply processing bureaucratically all the applications for developing new sites. We've seen it in Romania, where there has been a very interesting attempt to introduce or to facilitate presumption at a large scale, but have run into difficulties in local networks and in other ways. We've seen it in the Netherlands, in our Netherlands case study, where one wanted to get rid of traditional gases very quickly. Turned out to be hard, and only when they sort of reverted to a more flexible policy, we can see that there's a way out of the problems. It's also the case that risks seem to be increasing over time. It's quite clear from the practitioners, our surveys, that they see many of the risks. They are the same in the short and the long run, but they tend to be seen as more important over the longer term than in the shorter term. Some risks are also more important than others, and at the last point, second to last point here, I pointed out some of them. Infrastructure in general and networks in particular are seen as a huge challenge and potential for creating imbalances, in particular to allow new generation capacity and flows of energy across within countries and across countries. Also point to incentives, that investors get the right incentives to make sensible decisions, to understand what sensible decisions are, for consumers to adopt new technologies, become flexible, provide flexibility to the markets, and obviously technologies. How do we ensure that new technologies are becoming available at the speed that they need? And finally, which we point out in our discussion, that imbalances, as I already mentioned, are really an occurrence because of lack of coordination. Because investment in networks are not well coordinated with investment in generation. Investment in new intermittent technologies are not well coordinated with investment in storage, in batteries, in flexibility measures, and so on and so forth. So that leads us to our conclusions or recommendations. I think we have quite a few sensible recommendations, don't we, Andrei? And I'm sorry to have to summarize them in just a few points, but let me try. Firstly, we think it's very important to realize the magnitude of the challenge, of the huge investments that are needed to be undertaken there, not only in generation capacity, not only in infrastructure, but also in innovation and new technology. That in itself is very, very important to realize. Secondly, as I said, imbalances are a result of lack of coordination. Markets are coordination devices. We are lucky in Europe to have quite well-functioning markets. The energy crisis a few years back, although we saw prices that we've never seen before, the market essentially delivered what it should do. It ensured that there was enough capacity, energy around. So markets are instrumental. They're good to begin with, but they can be improved. However, markets can't do everything. There's going to be a huge challenge for regulatory authorities, and we pointed to some of the things that we would like to see from our regulators, from our regulatory authorities. That's more easily said than done, but they need to adapt to the changes over time. They need to respond to new challenges, and they need to adapt along the way. We also point to the importance of technology, and as the Prime Minister just emphasized, technology neutrality. We don't know what the right solutions are going to be over the next 15, 20, 25 years. So it's very important to allow the best solutions to come forward, and that means not picking winners, but to allow various alternatives to be available. And finally, this is not really something that neither Andrei or I are experts on, but it's quite clear that we can see that the energy transition is facing challenges at the political level, that people be willing to accept the costs, the investments, and so on and so forth. And we're arguing that trying to achieve some sort of a consensus about what is needed, what is required, is going to be very important to reach a balanced path to net zero. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Nils-Henrik. That was a great introduction to this report. I'm going to invite the panelists to come up for our panel session that we're now going to have on this. And I do want to start by saying my own congratulations to Nils-Henrik and Andrei, because when I looked at this topic, I thought, how on earth are you going to write a report on this? You know, produce a balanced pathway to net zero in 50 pages. And you have managed to do that using some of the methods that we've made a lot of use of at CERRE. There's some great survey work in there, looking at what people think, especially surveying our members. And there's some excellent case studies from around Europe, looking at what's I did ask Andrei, what's going well and what's going badly? It was mostly what was going badly. But that's a good place to start. I also want to add my thanks to our sponsors who are represented on our panel. And I do want to ask our panelists to come up now. Clara Poletti is the chair of ACER. I'm delighted that she's here to represent regulators and give us a regulatory perspective. Nicola Rega is the executive director for climate change and energy at Cefic, which is the European Chemical Industry Council. We heard the Prime Minister talk about the need to hear more from the voices of energy-intensive industry. And Domjan is going to come up, and he's the founder and Chief Policy and Global Affairs Officer at Enoda, which is an energy technology company, and it's great to have a sort of technology perspective on this particular topic. And Andrei Covatariu, who's a CERRE fellow, is going to come up. Why don't you sit here, Andrei? And if we've got any further questions about the report, we're going to refer them to you. So welcome, everyone. As we've discussed, what we're going to do is we're going to give our three panelists to my left 5 minutes just to give you a reaction to the report. And then, Andrei, I think you were going to just maybe pick up on one or two things that you wanted to say about the report. Clara.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me here. This is a very difficult, interesting topic. So how to manage imbalances and how to get rid of imbalances, that's impossible. So I think we should rephrase the question. How can we reduce the imbalance risk and how can we manage the residual risk? Because that's something that we know we are going to have. And I want to say that since the start, because somehow we are seeing a tendency to increase planning as if we could decide where we are going at what time and knowing exactly the challenges we are going to find on our way. But this is not the case. So I think the real challenge is to learn how to move under uncertainty and how to best react to the unforeseen from many standpoints. Having said that, so how to reduce risk, how to manage the risk, there are some no-brainers, and you mentioned them in the report, improving price signals, locational price signals, time, intertemporal price signals, improving transparency, and this is very important to remember and to recall, because sometimes we go back and ask ourselves, but do we really want well-functioning short-term markets? Do we really need them? Because prices, you know, I don't like them very much when they go high. So maybe it's better to change the way our short market works. So it's good to recall that markets are a very efficient coordination device, short-term markets. And then we get to the question, is that enough? Of course, I guess in Europe and in all different countries, we would get different answers. My answer is no, that's not enough. We have to do more. From the regulatory perspective, I agree that we need to improve the way we regulate looking forward and managing uncertainty. So, for example, something we need to do better is to consider the risk profile when defining the regulatory framework. And the risk profile is changing. It's not the risk profile we had 5-10 years ago. That was a different type of risk. And of course we have risk in our regulation, and we have learned how to handle part of the risk, but now we are going to face additional risks, and this is why we talk about resilience of our networks and how to assess situations that happen rarely but with big impacts. And so I need to look forward, I need to be adaptive, and then asking myself as regulator, am I going to lose certainty in my ex-ante regulation? Because I've learned first day at school that as a regulator I have to give ex-ante certainty. But giving certainty to the market doesn't require not changing rules. You have to set the framework example. You have to tell people what's going to happen if a new shock arrives. What's going to happen if a new technology comes to the markets. So you have to be clear as much as possible about the overall framework, but you have adjustments for sure. We had it in the past as well. Every 4 years, 5 years, you have the end of the regulatory period, and you can change everything under ex-ante certainty. So we have to make this adaptive framework more clear, and in order to do that, we need to have a clearer definition of roles, I think. I cannot build on total uncertainty about the future. And this is something I think in Europe that we need to improve. We have we had a lot of pancaking of different provisions, giving roles and responsibility to different actors, sometimes just overlapping them or without very good coordination. I'll give you an example. NECPs, regulators do not have a role, none. on network development plans, which are not the NECPs, by the way, and then we have the European, we have the national, but some regulators do not approve national development plans. And keep in mind that national development plans are something different from economic regulation of the service you're regulating. So as you see, this is just an example. I could add other plans that we have on paper, and they are not fully coordinated. And I think this is something is very important to remember. And just one last point about imbalance is that whenever you give the wrong signal to the market, and the market anticipates a possible imbalance in the future, you are going to have a reaction now. You're going to see prices changing now. And this is something we are seeing in gas, for example. So it's important that we are very careful about identifying what happens if we end up in an imbalance. We have to clarify the rules. Yes, I think this is a clear priority and something we've learned in the crisis.
Great, thank you. I'm very delighted that you're picking up on some of the themes that we've covered in some of our reports on adaptive regulation, but we'll come back to some of these reducing imbalances. Nicola, industry perspective on some of these things.
Yes, thanks for the invitation, also for the very good report, very timely, and of course, after having already heard about the chemical industry beforehand, it was a very good introduction from the Prime Minister, so I can only concur on what was mentioned before. I like to read this report also to bring it in the context in which we are operating nowadays. Where the issue of industrial competitiveness it's at the core of the agenda. Following what the Prime Minister was mentioning about the Antwerp dialogue, where we were co-organizers, we've been also following up with the Antwerp dialogues in which we are discussing many aspects. One of them, we are currently working together with the electricity industry to discuss about industrial electrification. How does it happen when electricity prices are not competitive, at least when it comes to fuel switching? And that is bringing exactly this discussion at the core of what we are trying to address moving forward. Because we are in a situation where the path to net zero future, absolutely not disputed. It's a matter of what kind of tools do we use to get there, and whether the framework in which we are operating it's supporting of that transition. When I put together all these elements, there is an element of cost which are embedded into it. And then, and of course, if electricity prices are too high compared to what we see with our competitors across the world, and are still higher than the pre-crisis levels, with all these investments that needs to keep on top of it, how are we going to pay for these investments? If they're going through the bill, then we are again going to increase the electricity cost, and therefore it makes it even more complicated to do that switching. So we need to find a way of smartly integrating all these key elements that are here. Because it's indeed, we are witnessing a lot of imbalances in the system, and all these imbalances at the end of the day are ending up into additional layers of cost that the system is embedding, and then that we are one way or the other paying for it. And I don't think that the solution for the future is to just try to recuperate what we have in the bag from the past. I'll give you one example. Here the key, at least for me, what we are now working a lot is on the flexibility part. Flexibility was something that industry has been quite sensitive towards flexibility, because was asked from the demand side to be more flexible, particularly the industry side. And of course, industry has been always very reluctant, because our goal is not to help the system. Our goal is to produce goods. So we need to respond to our customers, and some production processes can offer some options, others cannot. That was something which was used in the past to cut consumption at the times of critical systems. And then the market has developed in a way where some actors could do it, others could not do it. But then with the excess of renewable electricity production, then the dynamics are changing. And nowadays, there are many elements that we see in the spot market prices that start questioning a lot of the assumptions that were made in the past. Like, why do I need to sign a PPA, which requires, let's say, a fixed price when at the time it is producing? Well, that's when there is excess of electricity in the system, and then the prices are zero or negative. At that moment, I'm paying a higher price because it's the predefined price. So why should I do it? Is long-term contracts is the solution? Yes or no? Let's discuss. Again, it's a matter of what kind of prices is the market developing. New technologies that create this kind of a buffer solution that enables for more flexibility without having to ramp up and down production according to the weather forecast. So these are all elements that say, okay, how do we integrate all these elements into a framework which needs to be flexible as a regulatory framework, but at the same time needs to accommodate what are the bottlenecks that are in the system. Because infrastructures are not built over time, and what do we do in the meantime? And by the time we are getting there, then how else is the market reacting? And all this, we need to do it very fast. Very fast because it is also part of the discussion we are having with our, let's say, counterpart from the electricity production. The whole electrification agenda was built under the assumption there will be a growing demand for electricity. And on that basis, you keep on investing, knowing that there will be always someone new that will be there to pick up the additional electricity. And now we have a situation where a lot of industrial sites are closing down, and we are witnessing a destruction of demand. And so how do we try to revert that inertia? Because otherwise the whole business models start changing also on their side. I'll leave it here.
Great, thank you, Nicola. You're raising a lot of important points about prices and the underlying economics of all of this. I should remind everyone, please do be saving up your questions, and anybody who's online, please be putting your questions in the chat because we can pick some of those up. Paul, give us a sort of, is technology going to save us?
Well, it's certainly going to help. You know, before I move into that, look, first I'd like to really congratulate Nils-Henrik and Andrei and the CERRE team on a really excellent and I think very thought-provoking piece of work. And it's certainly been a pleasure and a privilege for us to be able to challenge you, as you recognized at the beginning, to form what I think is a real contribution to the debate in Europe. And part of why it's a real contribution to the debate in Europe goes to the question you just asked, Michael, which is, you know, this study really shows that the concern isn't about adequacy of production capacity or adequacy of bulk power. That problem's solved. We can produce lots of renewables. It's about network capacity. It's about flexibility. It's about planning uncertainty, market design. These were all the issues that were raised in the study. And I think, you know, oftentimes when I'm here in the Brussels bubble, I hear more and more about kind of this model of how do we build more renewables without necessarily a realization that that's not actually the problem anymore. Like, we solved that problem. Secondly, I think the study is an excellent contribution because it recognizes that we actually need to deal with imbalances on 3 different time horizons, or perhaps 4 types of imbalances. You know, imbalances among fuel types, short-term imbalances, including very short-term imbalances, the need to balance generation and load in real time to keep the network stable at 50 hertz. The medium-term imbalances, day to night, and then the longer-term ducal flout periods when the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow for weeks. And that the technology involved in addressing each of these will be different. And I think in the same way that, you know, over the last decade we've had kind of a fascination and a focus on just building renewables, sometimes there's a risk that today the equivalent is on building storage, and actually different types of technologies, including, but in every case not limited to storage, can address each of those horizons differently. And so I applaud you in breaking out those 3 different horizons. I would argue the one that's probably the least appreciated, but actually the most expensive today for European consumers, is the need to maintain the stable frequency at 50 hertz. You know, as we put in place more and more either nuclear that we can't turn off or renewables that we can't turn on, the second by second balancing of the network becomes more and more complicated and expensive. Which brings me to another point that I think Clara made, which is, you know, we have to recognize we're going to have residual risk, and we need to manage that residual risk. And I think one of the things that comes out well kind of in the margins of the report is the fact that we're trading one set of risks for another. You know, the previous system had a significant risk profile, and we saw that risk profile when the war in Ukraine began. You know, I began my life in Brussels not sitting here, but sitting at NATO as the commander's first energy security advisor, and I wasn't focused on net zero at all and had a tremendous risk profile to manage at the time. And I think we need to recognize that we're not, yes, the system will have risks, but it's not as though the system it's replacing didn't. You rightly recognize the need for innovation and new approaches, especially in the area of the grid. You know, it's important, I think, for us to recognize that the technology basket that's required for net zero isn't commercially available today. And if we try to implement the full transition for net zero with our current technology set, we're going to be doing the equivalent of trying to build the modern internet with dial-up modems. You know, there need to be a whole set of new technologies developed. And part of the reason for that is what the Prime Minister recognized earlier. You know, policy defines the problem, but this is the first technology transition in history that's been driven by policy. We look at every previous technology transition, and what's happening with AI is following this playbook perfectly. You've had innovators sitting in a university or a startup or a basement come up with something really unique and different, and policy runs to catch up. In this transition, it's gone the other way around. Policy has said, in order to save ourselves so we can still live on this planet, the planet will be fine without us, but you know, we need to prevent climate change so we can be comfortable here. In order to stop climate change, we need to achieve these specific goals. And the first of those was decarbonizing the power system with renewables. But if the policymaker doesn't have perfect foresight, which of course they don't, that policy-defined goal is necessary but not sufficient. And many of the imbalances that you document come from those areas where there was a policy-defined goal, that goal was necessary, it wasn't sufficient, and there are other aspects now that also need to be addressed. You rightly recognize the importance of technology neutrality to do that. I would argue that you also recognize, and the Prime Minister did in his comments, the importance of good regulation crowding in future innovations. And especially given that need for new technologies to come to the fore to deliver the transition. Flexibility is one part of that. The other part of that, and I guess this is the point I'd like to end on, the other part of that is I think Europe has a tremendously compelling offer for innovators based on the size of the market, the standardization of the market, the ability to access more than 400 million consumers with one regulatory framework. It doesn't do a great job of marketing that. So when I'm in the United States explaining as an innovator in energy technology why we're deploying in Europe first, my American counterparts think that I have vegetables growing out of my ears, because everyone in Europe knows about the IRA. Very few people in the US know what the common market energy could offer them.
Great, thanks, Paul. Yeah, a really important point about this is a transition driven by policy rather than by technology in the first instance. Andrei, any quick points about your report that you wanted to highlight?
Thank you, Professor. We've heard so many good points, so good that there's nothing for me left to say, actually. But there is one point, actually, that I want to highlight. And first, I would like to just start thanking Nils-Henrik and everyone involved in the project for an amazing job and for a very interesting work that we've done over this year. I think it's important to, we didn't look that much at the objective of the future, but we did look at the past. So we took a step back and we looked at the previous 5 years, and we did notice progress. And this is something that we've also highlighted in our ambitions paper at CERRE. There was progress made over the last 5 years, and especially over the last 2 years, given the context, there was progress made at EU level. Now, imbalances occur when there's a lack of both planning and I think, and also execution, as we were mentioning, basically, coordination, if you want, planning and coordination. But in times of crisis, there's not that much time for proper planning and proper coordination of actions. And in that sense, this progress that we've made over the last few years is valuable, I think. But to your point on how to decrease or manage, if you want, imbalances, not to eliminate because that would be virtually impossible, but how to manage that. I think at the end of the day, our conclusions point to 2 dimensions that are also connecting with your point on timeline. It is about mitigation and about adaptation to imbalances, I think. So mitigation is those things that we've, talked about for so many years, free markets that are showing the signal, predictable environments, policies and regulation and so on and so forth. But the fun part, I think, is the adaptation on how to adapt to imbalances. And we often, and the Prime Minister has mentioned that, Annika has mentioned that, Nils-Henrik has mentioned that oftentimes we tend to over-regulate in order to offset an imbalance that we are witnessing, that we are seeing in the markets or seeing in the energy systems. But oftentimes when we see an imbalance happening, that is already creating damages. That is already, is not in the making anymore. It's actually creating a specific damage in the market. So to overcompensate for that, to offset that, we tend to over-regulate, and sometimes we do it too much. It's like an old radio, that was set on a radio station, but for whatever reason goes off track. And then you try to adjust the dial to go from one place to the other to find once again the station, the sweet spot, but then you go from one extreme to the other to the radio noise, to the white noise, right? We tend to do that. We tend to over-regulate some aspects of our energy system, of the well-functioning of our energy systems, and oftentimes we do create other imbalances that are, once again, difficult to adjust or difficult to, address later on. I think that's one of the points that, would connect the idea of over-regulating and, sometimes not letting the markets, show the way, as we did in 2022, actually, some attempts to over-regulate markets instead of letting, the markets show, or the market signals to show the pathway forward. Yeah, I'll stop here. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. Anybody want to kick off with a question from the panel? If not, I'll have to ask one. Oh, there's one there. Just in the middle. With a microphone. I think Zoe's just getting you on. Just tell us who you are.
All right. Hello, and thanks for the presentation. My name is Andrei. I'm a consultant for Hanover Communications. The question is, across the board, is, of course, you talked a lot about the failure, or at least the need to cross-correct some of the policy actions, in particular the issue about different layers of planning that don't really overlap in particular. How do you see a fix to that? Well, we know that the next commission is going to look into the governance of the energy union. Is there something they can do to kind of fix the different overlapping, sometimes contradicting actions by different regulators? And then, of course, the other is what also the Prime Minister De Croo mentioned, it's innovation, how to finance innovation. We know there's a lot of ideas on the table for the next Commission to address, whether it's state aid, reform of the EU budget. How do you see that playing out? Do you have preference options for that? And in case of failure to reform the system to finance innovation, what could be an alternative? Thank you.
Okay. Great, thank you. Clara, so start with you. Overlapping planning problems, how can we solve them? Or do we actually, do we have them?
Yes, we do have overlapping, but in terms, if we look from the regulatory perspective, planning is a sort of ex-ante exercise, and when you actually regulate the economic performance, in my view, still we need to regulate the service, not the planning, because otherwise you end up paying for the wires and not paying for what you really get, and you probably end up building up a barrier or lack of incentives to work on innovative solutions. I think planning is useful because it puts on paper the constraints and helps understanding if I change that, this is going to change, you know, it's just a tool. But it's not the way we should regulate. And we should accept that if I pay for a given level of innovation or quality or a deployment of flexibility, now is the time to put money on the table for the value of what I'm getting, not just checking if the plan was realized, but understanding if what the company did was in line with what we expected and what we need.
Nicola, any industry perspective on planning overlapping jurisdictions?
Yeah, it's a nightmare, not only for that, but also because if you add on top of that also the specialized lawyers who are engaged to block any decision that is taken. So we have situations with planning and the companies go through the whole planning procedures and then you're still not allowed to build, and then you go back to court and back several times. So now we have was mentioned a project in Belgium to build a new chemical site. It's 10 years that are going back and forth. They don't manage to use it. As another example, in Germany, they've built a pipeline to transport CO2. It's been there for 20 years. They cannot use it because every time there is a new challenge, a new idea of how to challenge the pipeline and to do extra. And it's just becoming a nightmare. So if it's also if you pile up the issue with planning on the energy sector, plus also the whole exercise on the demand side, then I'm just wondering at the moment, where are we going? And I know that this because the typical response is yes, but planning it's a local level. Sure, but we also managed to do some regulation at the European level during the crisis with renewable energies. We managed to get some speeding. I think there is a moment we also need to understand what do we want out of all this process. Otherwise, we're going to just get stuck in exchanging papers.
Paul, I was going to ask you about the financing question. I mean, is there you're an entrepreneur in Europe, you're an American. Is there a financing problem? I listened to the Prime Minister, and I thought, is this really what's preventing the energy transition?
Yeah, let's talk about financing for a moment, because I think it's a question that gets asked all the time, and it's a really interesting one. There is plenty of funding for early innovation, grant funding, university funding, whatnot. Like Europe does that well. There is plenty of funding for deployment of technologies once they've received a commercial order. There's a huge gap between early innovation and commercial orders. And part of the reason this gap exists is because our venture capital ecosystem, both in the US and Europe, was built for software. And in software, you can leave the lab and get one customer. And then you get two customers. We produce substations, right? You go from 0 to hundreds, but nobody buys one substation that might work. Whereas they buy one piece of software that might work. It's a much more evolutionary incremental pathway So you have an ecosystem in venture capital that's all based on early customer adoption. And the energy transition is not going to be driven by early customer adoption. Why is that? It's because fundamentally the energy transition is about electrification. The electrical grid was designed 140 odd years ago, and it's an analog system. It's not software defined. So we need hardware innovation, and hardware innovation has a different funding cycle. Now, what worries me when this question comes up, so we need to bridge that gap, the so-called valley of death, where you're between, like it works in the benchtop to I have a customer. There are probably two ways to do that. One is to try to put public money into that gap. That's very hard to do because, as the Prime Minister rightly pointed out, the public sector isn't very good at picking winners. It's also hard to do because it gets very political. The other option is, how do you get that customer to come forward? And I think that's something that Europe is potentially well suited to do from a regulatory perspective. We're talking about anticipatory investments. We're talking about risk-based regulatory approaches, risk-based decision-making. Can we lower the barriers so that a utility can say, actually, yes, this is something new, but I can try it at a small scale. And that provides that early adoption traffic to draw in the private sector funding. I think we have a tendency in Europe to approach these questions of where can we put public money, as opposed to where can we use good regulation to draw in private capital. And certainly there's the opportunity to do the latter.
Great, thank you. Andrei.
Can I just have a quick thought on planning, because in one of our workshops, something very interesting came up. It seems that planning is a bit of a three-dimensional, let's say, process. So first of all, we are talking about two vectors. I mean, to reach net zero, you need some sort of coordination across, electricity and gas. And we've seen that in our case study on Quebec, on dual energy system. So that's one dimension. Then the second dimension is what you were referring previously, the coordination, if you want, between local, regional, and EU-wide jurisdictions. And that is also something that we've seen in the Spanish example on how local limitations may actually spill over to national, let's say, objectives. And then a third dimension is probably all these lenses that we need to have when we look at the objectives for 2050. Social aspects, economic ones, technical ones, environmental ones, and so on and so forth. So planning, or successful planning would need to incorporate all these three dimensions and would need to somehow involve all stakeholders across the board to actually deliver, once again, to coordinate on a less imbalanced, let's say, future.
Yes.
On coordination between electricity and gas and planning, I think this is something at a local level is not discussed much, and it's something that the regulator doesn't control directly, which is the electricity demand and gas demand and substitution. But the standard approach up to now has been giving incentives to the single customer to switch, let's say, in heating system, switching from gas to electricity, or maybe you can even have three systems at once in the same neighborhood, having electricity, gas, and district heating, and the choice is left to the individual. So there is more about a system of incentives than planning. I don't see an integrated plan. I don't see it in many countries in Europe, an integrated planning, and I'm not even sure we could talk about planning. It would be nice to have a planning. I mean, I would like to have a planning, but I don't see it.
In the UK, we've just got a national energy system operator to do integrated planning between electricity and gas. So that might be an idea. Anyone else in the room who wants to ask a question? Otherwise, I've got one online here. It's not an easy one. So how do you strike a balance between effectiveness and efficiency? Anybody want to go? Because I think a lot of this is about that. Yes, we want to promote net zero, but on the other hand, we want to do it at a reasonable cost. So how do we stay on a balanced pathway which trades those things off?
I don't know, but
This was directed to you, Clara.
to me, okay. I don't know, but I can say that if you want to avoid imbalance, not avoid imbalances, but reduce imbalances, you need redundancy. Redundancy means less efficiency and more cost, probably. So I have a question for everybody. Are we willing to accept some redundancy? Because this is something that is in your report as well, at least this is how I read it. Optionality has a value, but if you want to keep optionality, you need to pay for the option, or keep your gas infrastructures there for longer, or take the risk of over-investing in new infrastructures. So that's a question, is not an answer.
Okay, thank you. Nicola.
Yeah, no, I don't pretend to have an answer, but at least to have some points to reflect upon. It was also mentioned in the report, among one of the examples. I think Netherlands is a very good example of a network which is full, basically congested, and that's also what our members are experiencing. If you need to ask for a new connection, it says fine, wait for 10 years. And then when we start discussing, okay, but why do I need to wait for so long? And then the network operator say, well, the network is congested, and if you would have told me beforehand that you needed it, then I would have started planning in advance. And of course, how do I know what do I need in 10 years' time? I don't even know if I'm going to be in business in 10 years' time. But primarily from, again, from an end user perspective, where industrial end user, where we have a number of options to go towards net zero. Well, they're all in competition. So do I have infrastructures, yes or no? How much does it cost to go for one vector or the other? How much would it cost in the future? What is the perspective? So there is a lot of uncertainty from the end user side, at least from the industrial side, which is probably different from a residential side, where we have more or less have quite developed infrastructures for at least a couple of fuels to choose from. Now, on top of this dimension, there is something that we need to start thinking of, because yes, we have a problem, but also Prime Minister was mentioning in touching upon, you know, that we're not discussing small modular reactors. But we are looking at that as well as an option, because not so much in terms of new technology to deliver electricity to the system, but actually as a potential on-site energy generation. Now, if that, because that would also help us in on the one hand, addressing the issue of network congested and also network grids and costs that are coming together with getting electrons from the grid. At that moment, there's also an issue of redundancy that we need to have on our sides because of the security of production of our goods, which becomes a service for the network. So what we cannot get from the network, we can actually put in the network from the end user point of view. Again, when it's going to happen, I don't know. If I listen to, and yesterday I was chairing this group on nuclear, they talk about after 2030 and moving forward. Today was in the news that Google in the US is developing the first, deploying the first by 2030. One of our members also in the US by 2030, 3.0, will have the first SMR up and running. So maybe something is moving faster than we thought it would be. Just how are these new solutions going to change the landscape in which we are operating? And then maybe the waiting for the infrastructure becomes a different type of waiting, different type of addressing infrastructures. So it's just a matter of how do we put all the pieces, and maybe there are new innovations, innovative solutions that are being developed. What we notice in the market is that the uptake of electric technologies in industry has been quite slow over the past, I would say, 10 years. well, up until 10 years ago, because pretty much there was not big of an interest, and the innovation was not going there. Now we see new ideas coming up, which might have an impact on the way we are addressing the energy system in the future. So how do we, let's try also to be flexible also in looking at how new solutions might change the profile of the end users, and maybe the whole issue of planning and flexibility might have a different dimension in a couple of years.
Paul, efficiency versus effectiveness. Because, you know, this is pretty crucial for policymakers, isn't it? I mean, the reason why they delay effectiveness is because they're worried about efficiency.
I think they also have it's about what priors you start with. So let me offer a slight kind of a transatlantic perspective on this. You know, the biggest difference in the energy debate in this kind of room when I'm in, last time this was in Las Vegas in the US versus here, which is for the Edison Electric Conference, not for gambling. But the biggest difference in this panel, if we were in the US, would be that everyone would have said load growth 5 times. You know, there's a view in the US that enabling load growth is key to delivering economic growth, and economic growth is part of what we need to do. Whereas we don't have that same attitude. If we look at the Netherlands, you know, part of what is the Netherlands' problem? It can't accommodate any load growth. You know, it adopted a policy around electrification of heat that would inevitably lead to tremendous load growth and didn't adopt a policy around anticipatory investment to support that load growth. So there's a level at which we need to make some decisions about how much priority are we going to give to load growth and to enabling load growth through innovation. You know, from an innovator's perspective, you know, what we try to do is offer the technology choice to push that effectiveness frontier out and then allow regulators and utilities to make a different set of choices. You know, today we're having a debate about how do we incentivize flexibility on the load side by encouraging energy users to adjust their behavior. You know, we have a suite of technologies that enable that load adjustment to happen at the network level with voltage control without involving or changing the conditions of supply for the user. So now we don't need to pay the user because they're still receiving the same quality of power they did before. You know, innovation is going to enable us to deliver flexibility in ways that are much less painful and disruptive, and therefore complicated to roll out for the user than we have today. I mean, if I think back 20 years ago when I started, you know, had the first people come into my office to talk about the flexibility benefits of smart meters, you know, we thought that we would have dispatchable loads distributed across residential households by the 2010s. And we're still not there. And I don't think we're going to get there because the coordination problem is so large. So let's think about other ways to solve this problem and enable dispatchability, but not necessarily dispatchability that requires significant change in behavior from the user or significant replacement of the capital stock.
Great. I mean, great point about load growth. Having just come back from China, everything is easier if demand is growing at 8% a year. If it's not, you've got a problem because every pound you spend, every euro you spend appears directly on somebody's bill per unit. Andrei.
I hate to continue referring to our previous work at CERRE, but it goes back to regulation, I think, and planning, right? So is what we've touched upon in our previous report on what the role of regulation ought to be in the next few decades to facilitate, not hinder, actually, the energy transition, one that is orderly, just, inclusive, and so on and so forth. So at the end of the day, regulation would need to learn from the past, from previous experiences, would need to respond to current, let's say, challenges, and then look forward and anticipate as much as possible this uncertainty. And by doing so, to strike that balance in between, you know, effectiveness and being efficient. At the end of the day, I think it goes back to regulation and planning. Or this is just a way to dodge the question, or, you know, but I think it goes back to regulation, yeah.
Okay, great question over here. Get a microphone. Thanks, sorry.
Clemens Schuster, and the question of also what I want to pick up on financing innovation, and what you now brought in. Looking, for example, at how solar panels on private houses or on houses are distributed, I think in Europe we're going to see quite an obvious thing. The norther you get, the more solar panels are on the roofs. and the more south, the lesser. And especially maybe for economic reasons, but Germany, Austria, they have that since 20 years, 30 years, even innovators did that earlier. What everyone is lacking, that more or less each country does all of that by itself. So they do all of the production, import, distribution, and then of course we have the network question fully unsolved, kind of how the grid will balance the loads, all of that stuff. And just looking for my very private journey, being native Austrian, living in Switzerland, Germany, now in Belgium, and always we had this type of solar panels on our roofs. There are always different models how to acquire them, how to run them, how to get them reimbursed, how to fuel the networks, all of that. I think that is actually a very easy question for regulation. And if anyone has this kind of awkward idea of thinking of a European Union to regulate this question, I'd fully support it actually. And if we have that type of regulation security, there is no question that investments will follow, because then it's a very, very easy thing to know if, let's say, your regulation, if you build anything new or if you renovate anything, then let's say if there's a mandate to add some kind of solar or any other renewables, then it's kind of an easy thing to implement it, but that's fully lacking, and that's fully lacking all of the 27 states and also on the higher level.
Okay, great.
Can I say something about that?
Yeah, Paul, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, let me talk about solar for a second. I know this isn't exactly your question, but it kind of begs another question. So when I was studying political science, many, many years ago, we used to say that politics trumps economics. But what I've learned in the energy sector is that physics trumps politics. So you observe the fact that, as you go further north, you have more solar. I had this conversation recently with, I won't say which, a significant Southern European utility, and they said that makes perfect sense because further north they can afford to pay their customers to melt their transformers because the physics of the system don't enable that solar power to flow upstream. And this isn't a minor issue. It's led to the lifespan of transformers in Northern Europe falling from an average of 35 to 40 to 15 to 20. It's a huge damage to the capital cost stock. So I think it goes to one of the points we've been discussing here on integrated planning. Putting solar mandates is a great idea if we in parallel make the grid investments to let that power flow back upstream, and in parallel we make the long-term planning investments to figure out how to balance it. What too often has happened is these individual pieces happen in isolation. So we get a feed-in tariff in Spain that leads to substations being overloaded. It leads to a bit of a political kerfuffle over not being willing, over utilities no longer offering permits, because we didn't do the integrated planning to begin with of what are all the pieces that need to move to enable this rooftop solar at scale. So I think it really goes back to the same planning issue of, let's be realistic about the physics of how the system works. Let's think about what we want to achieve. Let's look at an option and then cascade through what are all the consequences of that, and what are the technology innovations we need so that the policymaker can draw new boxes. For example, I need a bidirectional distribution substation in order to bring those technologies to the fore.
Great. I think we'll stop with the question. I'm going to give each of the panelists 1 minute to say a positive example of where you think, there's been some good policy changes towards rebalancing for net zero, and something that you would like to see happen sooner rather than later in terms of rebalancing. So a positive and a negative about getting the balance better. Clara, do you want to go first?
Sure. That's not easy. I think the positive that I'm seeing is that we've been able in Europe to write network codes in a coordinated way. Network codes are rules that are directly applied at national level. I don't know of any other jurisdictions in the world where this has been done. So that was so challenging, and I'm proud that we made it. We made mistakes. Well, for sure we can improve, but that was something. Something that I think we can take as an example not to follow is the provision on energy sharing that is in the electricity market design, where there is a provision asking all member states to allow for physical energy sharing among consumers, small and bigger, and that to me doesn't make sense. It's like not being consistent with the market design that we all have in mind.
Great, thank you. Two brilliant ones. Nicola, positive and negative on balance.
Okay. I think on the positive side, I think we have seen now a rebalancing, first of all, in the narrative. Up until now was the highest energy prices, the highest was incentive to change behavior. Now I think we are getting to the point where we need to find different ways of looking at energy prices in what we want to achieve. And to, especially if we talk about electrification, we need to make sure that this is affordable. And in this respect, we are really now coming to some realism about what are the tools that the current regulation allows to use and how do we start making the best out of those. I'm focusing particularly on flexibility. There is a lot also in terms of integration and planning. We really need to be now serious about what is already in regulation and implementing much more thoroughly. Negative side, I'll say we've been focusing too much on target setting, multiple target setting, and this has led to a lot of lack of follow-up, particularly looking at the grids and how do we integrate the markets together. This has been really left behind, and if there is one thing we need to recuperate is exactly to look at how do we transition in a new system, what are the lessons learned, and how do we readapt? So far we've been too much looking backwards, and I think we also need to look forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul, positive and negative examples of balance.
Clara stole my positive, so I've had to quickly think of another one. I was going to talk about the network code for demand response and that process continuing. So my positive will be 2019-944 and the introduction of a framework across the European Union for aggregation. Dispatchability, load management is going to be a huge part of flexibility, and I don't know of another part of the world that has really committed at this kind of scale to creating a framework to aggregate load and dispatch it. In terms of the part that I'm concerned about, it's that I worry and I mentioned it earlier, I think we're putting too much emphasis on storage and not enough on resolving on what storage can do, and we're making a non-technology agnostic choice that has the risk both of dramatically increasing the cost of electricity because we end up using lithium ion as a storage solution that can do everything from frequency to diurnal shifting, but probably isn't the best at any of those, and actually also hindering our transport transition by putting our batteries into the grid rather than into vehicles. Whereas we really need to ask ourselves, how do we maintain frequency stability? How do we maintain balance across the day? How do we deal with periods of low renewable generation? And treat those as really technology agnostic questions.
Andrei, I'm going to ask you a slightly different question because you've written a whole report on this.
Yes.
Two interesting things you were particularly interested by as you wrote the report.
That's difficult. So I think one of the conclusions that we kind of had is that when it comes to addressing these imbalances, we should start with the quick fixes, as we've mentioned here, some of the quick fixes that we've mentioned here, but at the same time also start with things that take longer. Because grid issues, for instance, grid deployment, grid regulation will not happen overnight. So in order to avoid other imbalances that would become at some point, short-term imbalances, we need to also start with the things that take longer, not only with the quick fixes. And in the end, maybe one point that I would emphasize, going back to my first point, is to be gentle with the radio dial. On how to adapt to imbalances.
That's a good point. Don't over-rebalance.
Exactly.
Thank you very much. Perhaps everybody can join me in thanking our panel for a wonderful set of comments, and thank you for all your questions. Christina?
Thank you. Thank you to our respected panelists as well as to our CERRE academics for their valuable contributions to today's discussions. A special thanks to Michael Pollitt for expertly moderating this session.